Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, all members shall have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. At the moment, the ranking member is not here, so we will dispense with the opening statements. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3864. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3864 to reauthorize the Native American Housing Assistance and
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce, to offer an amendment in the nature of substitute. Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
Yes, I have
copies of the amendment have already been distributed and are on the dais, so the clerk will report.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Pierce. At the end of the amendment...
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act was first signed into law in 1996. This 5-year reauthorization bill is a model in how the federal government can, by increasing stakeholder participation, assist millions in creating better living conditions and housing opportunities for low-income families. NAHASDA has become the driving force for greater self-determination and self-governance for Native American tribes by allowing them more authority over spending their federal affordable housing funds. The program gives tribes the flexibility to determine who they serve, what types of eligible activities they offer, and how they deliver the federal funds for the programs and projects. Although this gives tribes greater freedom, HUD does maintain an appropriate oversight role through reporting requirements, on-site monitoring to ensure dispersed funds are spent correctly, and authority to recoup unexpended funds. This legislation also allows for tribes to pursue alternative funding sources by encouraging private investment. This pilot program decreases dependency on the federal government and increases investment with the community through public-private partnerships. I would like to thank all those who assisted in the development and promotion of this legislation, including Congresswoman Gwen Moore, Congressman Denny Heck, Congressman Dan Kildee, Congresswoman Kristen Cinnamon of this committee, as well as Congressman Don Young, Congressman Tom Cole, Congressman Richard Nolan, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman Colleen Hanabusa, and Congresswoman Betty McCollum. Along with their staff, they have worked tirelessly to make the reauthorization of this act possible in a truly bipartisan effort that achieves many of the reforms requested by Native American tribes nationwide. These reforms will result in more efficient use of taxpayer money and provide quicker approval of projects, allowing tribes to focus funds and resources on development and innovation instead of administrative requirements. NAHASDA was designed to promote development, increase flexibility for tribes, and provide the self-determination that tribes deserve. This legislation expands upon those principles and represents an opportunity for greater prosperity for a cross-section of our society that in many parts of the nation is truly in need of assistance. Today is an opportunity to reauthorize and build upon a program that has been instrumental in supporting our tribal communities. One of the requirements to move this bill is to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, removing Title VIII concerning housing for Native Hawaiians. This first and foremost priority must be keeping this bill moving along in the legislative process. However, while I appreciate the work of the chairman and the committee staff, I believe the strongly bipartisan version of this bill is the best possible legislation for Native Americans. Look forward to working with the committee and my colleagues in the House and Senate to finalize this bill with the strongest product possible. Thank you for your consideration of this bill today. I yield back.
For what purposes, gentlemen from Washington seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know this is a contentious bill and certainly can be a contentious issue, but it's a discussion I'm very glad we're having today. And I want to remind everybody what underpins the need for this program. Treaty rights. Treaty rights. Because the federal government has a trust obligation to promote the well-being of Native Americans. Ensuring the continuation of the NAHASDA Housing Programs Authority is a part of meeting that obligation. For 20 years, NAHASDA has provided funding for tribes to implement their own strategies, customized to address housing needs that are unique to their communities. Under the program, tribes can use funds to address their housing needs through a variety of activities, and that is how it should be, including construction and rehabilitation, modernization, rental assistance, lending programs, crime prevention, and a host of other programs. Just a few years ago, the Puyallup tribe in my home state, in fact in my district, used NAHASDA funds to construct not just new housing, but housing that fits their culture. We're not talking about craftsman homes or Tudors or colonials. A Puyallup home is a longhouse. So that is what the tribe recreated. The longhouses embrace Puyallup's history and their identity today. And this is just one tribe out of hundreds creating meaningful homes through NAHASDA. But there's no question the program has failed to keep pace with the need. Tribal members in my district and all over this country continue to struggle to find affordable housing. Earlier this year, HUD found that overcrowding affects 16% of households on tribal lands and 10% of tribal households in urban areas. 68,000 additional units are needed to replace severely inadequate units and eliminate overcrowding just in tribal areas. And that's why reauthorization of NAHASDA is so critical. And that's why I was so proud to join my colleagues to help co-sponsor the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Reauthorization Act. I appreciate very much Congressman Pierce's continued leadership on this effort, and I'm proud to be one of the co-sponsors. This was a deliberate, bipartisan process that 9 members worked together on, including a member of this committee, Ms. Moore. Unfortunately, as we all know, that bill we introduced is not the same one that is before us today. The substitute amendment strips out important provisions pertaining to Native Hawaiians. It is language that was the subject of a lot of discussion between all the members who put this bill together. Without it, the bill fails to support Native peoples who we have an obligation to that's equal to those on the mainland and in Alaska. Mr. Chairman, rather than working together on language we can all support, the majority's amendment erodes that bipartisan effort and makes achieving a final bill, well, frankly, more difficult. So while we may pass the bill today, I'm committed as one person, as I know others are, to continuing to work with members of this committee, the Native American Caucus, and the members of the Hawaii delegation to find a solution. I thank the chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Let's see, who seeks recognition on the majority side? I thought I saw somebody. If not, for what purpose is the gentleman from Colorado hastening back to his chair seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate all of my colleague, Mr. Pierce's hard work on this. Access to affordable housing can be the difference between a successful community and a failing one. The Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act has been particularly helpful for our Native American tribes living off or near tribal Indian lands. Native American tribes do have unique needs, and NAHASDA has been an important program in meeting these needs. Specifically, NAHASDA has allowed tribes greater self-determination and self-governance by allowing them more authority over their federal affordable housing funds. By giving Native American tribes the tools necessary to provide for their own, such as improved access to private mortgage markets and improved development of private capital markets in tribal lands, tribes can better account for their specific needs. Mr. Pierce's reauthorization legislation ensures that the good work of NAHASDA can continue through the appropriate congressional channels, while increasing taxpayer protection and encouraging private investment for housing needs. This legislation is crucial to the continued success of NAHASDA and the continued success of Native American tribes. By reauthorizing this program, we make it more accountable to the taxpayer and expand opportunities for tribes. I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation here today, and I thank the committee for its consideration of it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by expressing my full support for reauthorizing the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, or NAHASDA, and for increasing funding for these important programs. I've been deeply disappointed in President Trump, who has shown nothing but utter disrespect for Native Americans since he came into office. He ignored protests from Native Americans and approved a federal permit for the Keystone Pipeline, which would cross through the territories of numerous tribes, potentially subjecting them to hazardous oil spills. He used a racial slur disparaging Native Americans at an event that was intended to honor Native American veterans. He slashed the size of 2 national monuments, which include sacred Native American sites, to appease the interests of uranium mining companies, and his budget request for funding year 2018 would have significantly reduced funding for Native American housing programs. Native Americans deserve better from our government. We in Congress and on this committee can make a difference by supporting affordable housing for low-income Native Americans. While I commend the bipartisan efforts that went into this bill, I cannot support it in its current form because aspects of the bill would seriously compromise the affordability of NAHASDA assisted housing. For example, under this bill, funding recipients would no longer be required to keep tenant rent payments at a maximum of 30% of the tenant's adjusted income. This would also be no hardship exemptions for those who cannot afford higher rent payments, potentially putting them at risk of homelessness. It is unacceptable to remove a basic requirement that ensures that the housing supported by these affordable housing programs actually be affordable. Further, this bill would undermine other tenant protections by enabling broad waivers and exemptions from key protections, including, of course, the 30% maximum rent requirement and other safeguards for tenants in the demonstration program established in Title VII, as well as the HUD-BOSH program, HUD-BOSH set-aside program established by Section 501. This substitute amendment also arbitrarily excludes a reauthorization for the Native Hawaiian housing programs, which undermines Congress's longstanding recognition of the special relationship between the U.S. and Native Hawaiians at a time when we have a president and an administration who seem to be ripping up the longstanding bonds that have knitted our country. Congress should instead honor Americans' commitment to Native Hawaiians. For these reasons, I continue to oppose this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to support my colleague, Mr. Pierce's reauthorization of NAHASDA, H.R. 3864. I represent Oklahoma, which is home to 32 tribes and has a long history of tribal involvement. This program is important to my tribal constituents because it gives them a greater chance at self-governance by combining federal housing assistance programs and giving them a choice on which assistance to receive. I supported the creation of this program in 1996, and I'm happy to do so again. Mr. Pierce has already detailed the bill accomplishes the goal of reauthorizing while making and adding necessary reforms. I appreciate the bill's consolidation of all environmental requirements on affordable housing under a single review. This will make it easier for approval of tribal housing developments. I also bring to the committee's attention the demonstration project established by the bill that would allow tribes to seek private funding sources for their housing needs. This bill ensures that NAHASDA funds are actually spent at the tribal level by ensuring the ability of HUD to recoup unspent funds above a certain threshold and then redistribute them to other tribal entities. H.R. 3864 strikes the necessary balance of continuing to benefit tribal communities while also maintaining proper oversight, and it does so in a bipartisan fashion. And I would like to take a moment to note and to express my appreciation to Mr. Pierce. His tenacity in reauthorizing this bill, in what in recent years has been a difficult legislative environment to work in, says something about his focus on working for the best interest of his constituents and the taxpayers as a whole. I think that's an admirable quality, and I thank him for this effort on the bill, and I urge my colleagues to report it favorably today. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Would you yield to the chairman?
Of course.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding, and I just wanted to follow up on a couple of your comments. I like the word that you applied to the chairman of the TIF committee tenacity, and he has been very tenacious indeed in dealing with the NAHASDA reauthorization. And it is unfortunate that it has been many, many years since NAHASDA has been reauthorized. It certainly has not been from lack of effort from the gentleman from New Mexico, who has been tenacious again in trying to get this reauthorized for his constituents. So I, too, want to add my voice to yours and thank him for his work. The NAHASDA does represent an important consolidation of HUD programs. I think that in the gentleman's reauthorization, we will see a strengthening of taxpayer protections and tribal accountability. This bill will allow the tribes that are impacted to pursue alternative funding sources by encouraging private investment, which is an incredible, innovative reform. I think we will see greater efficiencies in the program in deploying NAHASDA funds. And so, again, I just want to thank the gentleman from New Mexico for his work, for his leadership. And I would encourage all members to support the reauthorization, the underlying bill.
Reclaiming my time, I appreciate the chairman's acknowledgement of the good work of one of our good colleagues. That is something to always be respected and appreciated by us all. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Wisconsin seek recognition? The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for recognizing me, Mr. Chairman, and I want to join you in thanking the tenacious gentleman from New Mexico for his really hard work on this bill, and Mr. Heck and Mr. Lucas, folks who are not on our committee, Mr. Cole, Mr. Young, Mr. Kildee. There have been so many people who have worked very, very hard. I just want to appreciate Mr. Pierce for the bipartisan approach that he has taken in terms of trying to make sure that all of the stakeholders can come together. This is truly a bipartisan process. It's not always comfortable, but it is what it is. Let me just say that our Native communities are some of the poorest and most in need of affordable housing. Many of us think of the gaming income that these tribes receive, and it comes nowhere close to being able to meet the plethora of need. H.R. 3864 reauthorizes and enhances the Native American housing reauthorization in a way that both makes it more feasible and practical for tribal housing agencies to serve their people, and in a way that acknowledges sovereignty and the unique roles that tribals play. And their constitutional, our obligations in the Constitution for Native peoples. As introduced, H.R. 3864 also properly recognizes all indigenous people. I will offer an amendment later, specifically to reform this omission in the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I'll have more to say on that later, but Hawaiians were conquered by the United States, and there's a long-standing law that says that Native is not a racial classification when it comes to the U.S. government meeting its special trust relationships with Native people under the Constitution. And Mr. Chairman, without objection, I would like to submit a letter that was penned to Donald Trump from and signed by Pierce, Heck, Young, and me that clarifies without objection that that indigenous people it's a political group but not a racial group.
Without objection.
Now, I also know that the ranking member is worried about the Brooks rule, and it's related to the 30% rule. Now, normally, I would be in the trenches with my ranking member, Ms. Waters, defending this bedrock principle of affordable housing policy. However, in the context of tribes, the rule is not necessary, and actually, it takes resources from the goal of building and maintaining Indian housing. In the usual context, we're familiar with funding for administration of compliance with the rule being independent of program funds. But in the case of tribal housing, the administration of the housing comes from the actual allocation and thus decreases the resources available to the tribes. And the tribal housing organization operates solely for the benefit of the tribe. That's the difference. So I believe that we can safely devolve some control to these sovereign peoples in the case of their stewardship over keeping the housing affordable for their members. And I say this because of my profound respect for Ranking Member Waters, her passion on housing policy, and I understand her position, even if I would not favor an amendment adding the Brooks Rule. It may seem to my detriment that I'm pointing out the areas of disagreement down to these two issues. But let me say this. We have had these disagreements, but we have worked together to get this product here today and out to the floor. This is truly why all of us came to Congress. This is truly the way we've wanted to work. You argue, you debate, you amend, and you finally get it done. All of us have given a little, and we've gotten a little. But none of us have compromised our principles. None of us have compromised our desire to see Native peoples being housed decently. We've twice passed this bill materially with most of the people on this committee supporting it with Hawaiians and with the Brooks Rules language. And I hope we're all able to get on the same page as we introduced it, and I yield back.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Who seeks recognition?
I have an amendment.
For what purpose does anybody else seek recognition on the amendment in nature of substitute and the amendment of the nature of the substitute? For what purpose, gentlemen from Ohio, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned about this.
Gentlemen, move to strike the last word.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I'm concerned that the gentlelady's amendment undermines the spirit of the Supreme Court decision Rice versus Cantano, and I'm concerned that it really sets a precedent that the court tried to make sure we didn't go down. And expanding the legislation, even modestly, as this amendment seeks to do, it could be a first step toward creating a race-based government programs that benefit one race of American over another. It could also be the first step toward creating an extra-constitutional race-based government in Hawaii, one where ordinary Hawaiians are governed by radically different sets of laws and constitutional protections than their native Hawaiian counterparts. America is a melting pot of cultures from around the world. And Justice Kennedy noted in his opinion in Rice versus Cayetano, the state of Hawaii will address these realities, but one of the beginning points must be the principle that the Constitution of the United States has become the heritage of all citizens of Hawaii. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman, yield back. Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
We have a problem. What? We have a problem. Okay. Hey, Lucas, how you doing?
Surely we can use that. Can we figure out how to use it?
That's okay, for next time.
Okay, okay. Listen, I just want to appoint they appoint, who is the ombudsman? To the exam director, And then they appeal back to this one. In safety and soundness, they appeal back. Okay, who is on the financial institutions? So that's the Fed. Okay, so then that's the exam director. What are you doing? Just while we're talking.
Lisa?
That much money being generated every year.
Have you seen is the one on the draft parity?
With that, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Waters, page 7, strike line 4 through
Without
15.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. And without objection, the amendment is revised to read the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Page 6, strike lines 18 through page 7, line 4, and redesignate the remainder of the line and page numbers accordingly. Again, without objection. Gentlelady is now recognized on her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would strike the provisions of this bill that would compromise the affordability of housing supported by NAHASDA funding. Specifically, it would preserve the Brooke rule, which ensures that tenants only pay a maximum of 30% of their adjusted income on rent. The Brooke rule is long-standing federal housing policy that applies to most HUD-assisted tenants and has applied to NAHASDA programs since their inception. It is widely considered the benchmark for affordability among renters in the United States. While I fully support and respect tribal sovereignty, I don't believe there's any reason that low-income Native American tenants should be expected to pay more for their rent than other HUD-assisted tenants. At the end of the day, this is an affordable housing program, and the Brooke rule is a basic requirement that ensures that NAHASDA funding is, in fact, supporting affordable housing. So for these reasons, I would urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the ranking member's just passion for protecting low-income people of all sorts. However, this amendment is going to strike a very key section of the bill, a key section which allows sovereignty, self-determination. The tribes tell us that if we will give them the flexibility, they can determine who has incomes maybe that don't show up on paper. They understand what the gentlelady is trying to do, and they recognize it, but they also say that many times there are abuses of the program that they would like to take care of themselves. And this if we give them the right to figure out their own programs, number one, I think they'll do it. Number two, they become much more I think much more effective in the overall scope of trying to have a program that is effective, that it's efficient, that it gets rid of some of the problems that we've seen in the past. So that's what we were trying to do in the underlying bill. And again, I appreciate the gentlelady's comments. I appreciate what she's trying to do. I don't think we disagree in the idea that we should never let our programs exploit the poor. But again, the Native Americans are asking for the flexibility here to run their program. They don't receive subsidies to help members pay for it, and so they need the ability to build in their own designs so that their members are treated fairly across the board. I think that's what they're after in our original bill, and so would kindly oppose the gentlelady's amendment and yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I would yield.
Thank you. And I would agree with Mr. Pierce on that point. Tribes are sovereigns, and we want to give them the authority and the flexibility and the opportunity to craft their programs in a way that best fits their community. And if you have as many tribes as I do and you're able to watch tribal elections, they're pretty rigorous, and these issues come up, and those tribal elected officials are held accountable by the members in that tribe that they serve. And they're only going to do things that benefit the tribe and tribal members. And again, there's nothing wrong with saying, let them choose their destiny. Let them have the flexibility to set up a program without the nanny state dictating to them how to do it. And I have faith in our tribal governments that if people might be able to pay more, they can choose to go down that option. If they need more housing and a little more than 30% has to come in, I think that should sit in the purview of the tribe. And I think, though I think the ranking member is coming at this from with a very good heart, I do think it undermines the sovereignty of our tribes, and giving them opportunity and flexibility to chart their own course makes sense in Mr. Pierce's draft legislation. That I yield back to Mr. Pierce.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the ranking member. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays have it, and the amendment is not adopted. Is there further discussion? There being, For what purpose does the gentlelady from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't sure you had concluded that vote, but I have an amendment at the desk. Thank you.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
That allows Franken to run again, huh? What did I ever do to you? Well, what did that Roy Moore say?
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Moore. At the end of the amendment, add the following new title.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This is a very simple amendment. It simply adds back in provisions that would properly keep Native Hawaiians in NAHASDA to bring this in line with the bill that I so proudly co-sponsored with many of my Republican and Democratic colleagues. The indigenous inhabitants of Hawaiian need NAHASDA, and they belong in NAHASDA. 31% of the chronically homeless in Hawaii are Native Hawaiian. 42% of Native Hawaiians struggle to meet housing costs. And even with a quarter of the Native Hawaiian households being overcrowded. I would respectfully express my disagreement with our illustrious chairman that Hawaiian is an unconstitutional racial classification. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court in Morton versus Makari affirmed and strengthened its finding when it unanimously decided that Indian preferences do not constitute racial discrimination in violation of the Due Process Clause. Rather, they derive from the historical obligations of the federal government to tribes and are thus political, not racial. The federal government recognized Native Hawaiians as an indigenous Native people with the same trust responsibilities owed other Native people in the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920. So we may have our opinions, but I am citing to you, members of this committee, Mr. Chairman and others, the constitutional law and law, the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920. It is not our job to overturn law because of our opinions about whether or not Hawaiians are a racial group, which they are not, or whether or not they are indigenous people, which they are. As you all know, it's well established that for purposes of meeting the trust obligation under the United States Constitution, Native is not a racial classification, but a political one. A bipartisan group of representatives sent a letter to Secretary Carson on that point earlier this year. And I think that this amendment simply affirms the obvious and the Supreme Court precedent on the issue of indigenous Hawaiians being indigenous people and Native not being a racial classification. Literally every tribal community in the United States of America, mainland, Hawaiian, Alaskan, supports inclusion of Native Hawaiians, and even the Chamber of Commerce has endorsed H.R. 3864, including Native Hawaiians. Let's not hold up so much for so many based on a faulty understanding of our laws and our Constitution. In an age when division is so high and rancorous, we should not look to further divide people, and especially the first people of this nation. NAHASDA is too important, and it will not pass without Native Hawaiians included, so the Senate tells us. This is a fight that must be fought for justice. So I would urge all my colleagues to support my amendment, because without it, I fear that NAHASDA cannot be made law, just because we have drawn these ideological battlegrounds not based in fact, not based in law. As much as NAHASDA is a priority for me, I am prepared to vote no on this bill if Native Hawaiians are not included. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back for purposes. Gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and in recognition to my good friend from Wisconsin, I always look forward to her comments. She's filled with passion. She's filled with just the most dynamic descriptions of why she feels the way she does. She reasons well. She's been a very close ally in becoming an architect in this bill. I hear your comments and those of Mr. Heck before you, that your concerns. Just appreciate the work on the bill. Unfortunately, I just can't support this amendment. We just have to keep the bill moving forward. And again, compliment you for all the work on the underlying bill.
Will the gentleman yield for just a second?
Yes, I would yield to the gentlelady.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. I just, Mr. Chairman, would like to enter into the record letters from the National Congress of American Indians supporting the inclusion of Native Hawaiians, from the National American Indian Housing Council, a letter from the Hawaiian delegation of Congress in both houses, Colleen Hanabusa, Brian Schatz, the U.S. Senator from Hawaii, Tulsi Gabbard, and Mazie Hirono. I would like to enter into the record a letter from the state of Hawaii and from the state of Hawaii, Department of Hawaiian Homelands. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Without objection.
I thank the gentlelady for her comments. And again, just judging from the past two Congresses, I suspect that this discussion is not finished. But again, would thank the lady for her submission, but will unfortunately not support. And would yield back.
Would you yield to the chairman?
Yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin first.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding, and I would just echo his remarks. I share the concern of the gentlelady from Wisconsin as well, but I think when we look at the politics of this, this issue becomes very divisive within the Congress and has the opportunity to potentially tank NAHASDA reauthorization, which the gentlelady knows how important it is to our home state of Wisconsin. We did a field hearing together on a mold issue, and the conversation went well beyond mold, and we see the importance of housing in Indian country. And I would also note that Barney Frank, when this came up, separated these two issues because it was so divisive, even when my friends across the aisle were in charge of gavel. So I think the gentleman from New Mexico makes a good point, saying let's keep this legislation moving forward. Let's get a reauthorization of NAHASDA. Let's deal with the Native Hawaiian issue separately. And I don't find myself quoting Barney Frank very often as a strategist, but I will hear your own chairman was forced to deal with it in that same fashion that I think we should today. And I haven't made a comment on the underlying bill as well. I just want to thank the gentleman from New Mexico for his great work. There were some issues that I had with regard to oversight on ICDBG money that was the basis of one of our hearings up in Hayward, Wisconsin. We weren't able to resolve that, but I have a commitment from the gentleman from New Mexico that we can work together in the future to resolve some of those greater issues. But I'm supportive of the underlying text because we get a reauthorization and we get good reform, and I think he's done a great job of bringing in a bipartisan group of folks to make sure we're taking care of folks in our tribal lands. With that, if I can just make one last point, we do have to make sure there's distinctions. And Native Hawaiians, I don't believe, are considered tribes. They're not part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So there is, I think, some ability to separate these two and handle them in two different tracks. And I think there's a willingness on the committee to deal with it in that fashion, which I think could give us a successful end result for both. But when you combine them, I think that's when the bills blow up. With that, I would yield back to the gentleman from New Mexico.
Thanks. I would yield to the gentleman for Texas. Okay, yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Well, in that case, the chair will recognize himself. I simply, to some extent, want to echo the comments of the gentleman from Wisconsin, the gentleman from New Mexico. Right, wrong, or indifferent, the gentlelady from Wisconsin's amendment is highly contentious. I would hate for it to prevent the bill from going forward. Should it be accepted, I feel very strongly this bill will not make it to the House floor. And we do know that there is Supreme Court precedent in Rice v. Cayetano dating back almost 2 decades, dealing with this issue on whether or not Native Hawaiians are part of a U.S. tribe or represent an unconstitutional racial set-aside offensive to the 14th Amendment. I suggest we will not solve that issue in this committee. For those who are interested in ensuring that Native Hawaiians have this status, there is another route to take. But I think we have a bill, an underlying bill, which should move forward. I lament the gentlelady from Wisconsin's position. I guess to some extent I heard that the perfect will be the enemy of the good. I think, again, the status of Native Hawaiian set-asides ought to be separate from this issue, as the gentleman from Wisconsin pointed out. The last time the Democrat Party was in charge of this committee, under Chairman Barney Frank, whose portrait sits, ironically, over my right shoulder, he himself separated these two issues, which was the last time NAHASDA was formally reauthorized in the 110th Congress. Again, Chairman Frank separated these two issues, and Chairman Pierce's approach simply follows Chairman Frank's precedent. Again, should the gentlelady from Wisconsin's amendment be adopted, my very, very strong prediction is this NAHASDA bill will never make it to the House floor, and that would be most unfortunate. So again, I would encourage us to separate these two issues. I would encourage us, depending upon your perspective, for those who believe in the gentlelady's amendment, not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and allow the underlying bill to proceed forward. And I yield back the balance of my time. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Wisconsin. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays have it, and the amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Wisconsin seek recognition? A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. The sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment or discussion? If not, there being no further amendments, record votes on the pending amendment has been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motions to adopt the amendment in the nature of the substitute as amended, if amended, and to report the measure. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 2219. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2219, to increase the role of the financial industry in combating human trafficking.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Human trafficking has, as we know, devastated the lives of millions of survivors around the world, including here in the United States, certainly in Southern California. And the International Labor Organization estimates that we've got about $150 billion in illegal profits that are made from forced labor each year. These profits have made human trafficking the third most valuable criminal enterprise in the world today. Traffickers are laundering their illicit profits through financial institutions that they can access with a click of a keyboard. So cutting off their access to the banking system is critical to putting an end to these illegal operations. This is the End Banking for Human Traffickers Act. It's going to help law enforcement and financial institutions identify and report suspected human traffickers so that they can be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral, and I think it should see swift action and strong support. So I'd ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter also of support from the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition, and I'll yield back.
Without objection. Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, for introducing this bipartisan legislation that would strengthen the public and private sector's work to combat human trafficking and improve coordination towards this common objective. Specifically, this bill would add the Treasury Secretary to the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and it would require the task force, the Treasury Department, and federal banking regulators to work together to develop recommendations to improve the ability of financial institutions to target money laundering associated with human trafficking. I've always believed that following the money is the best way to counter illicit activity, and human trafficking is certainly no exception. By adding the Treasury Department to the task force and focusing its efforts on identifying and combating the laundering of illicit funds associated with human trafficking, I'm hopeful that we can make progress on this critical issue. Although the human toll is impossible to calculate, according to the International Labor Organization, human trafficking generated $150 billion in illicit profits in 2012 alone. Unfortunately, today, there are millions of victims worldwide, including in the United States, who are used for forced labor and sexual exploitation. Some studies suggest that almost 70% of these victims are female and almost 1/3 are children. Financial institutions are in a unique position to help in the fight against human trafficking, and I believe it is important that we recognize the hard work they have been doing to combat these heinous crimes. As the legislation before us recognizing, it is also essential that we support them by providing appropriate feedback and elevating best practices to make advancements in this area. So I would urge all my colleagues to support this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose, gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Royce, for his efforts on this bill to end human trafficking by working to cut off the funding used to perpetuate it. Mr. Royce's bill, H.R. 2219, the End Banking for Human Traffickers Act, would require the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, or FFIEC, to review and enhance where necessary. Training and procedures to improve the ability of anti-money laundering programs to target human trafficking operations, and procedures for referring potential human trafficking cases to the appropriate law enforcement agency. H.R. 2219 also requires the State Department to bolster the reporting efforts on the elimination of money laundering related to human trafficking and the number of investigations, arrests, indictments, and convictions in money laundering cases related to human trafficking. As we set better standards, training, and procedures through the FFIEC to tackle this, we will be able to help the financial industry focus on high-risk indicators that may show sex and labor trafficking of persons. In turn, this will allow for an increased number of law enforcement referrals and prosecutions. This bill will shine a needed spotlight on the issue of illicit financing used in human trafficking. This bipartisan piece of legislation will help to curb the appalling epidemic of human trafficking, and I urge my colleagues to join me in voting yes on this bill. With that, I yield back the balance of my time to the chairman.
Gentleman yields to the chairman. I simply wish to add my voice to the sponsors on gentlemen from California and those on the other side of the aisle. An incredibly important issue, and I think that the gentleman, particularly from California, given his position not only being on our committee, but chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is in a unique position to provide leadership and to make sure that we have focus at Treasury on the human trafficking phenomena. As we know, this is regrettably a business, an illicit business, an evil business, but it is a global business, and it's one that leaves a money trail. And I'm not sure we've had the sufficient focus on this at Treasury that it deserves, that it has had and will need to have. I mean, the scale of human trafficking globally is beyond recognition. Millions, tens of millions of people have been enslaved. And so I just want to thank the gentleman from California for his leadership. Those who have worked with him on the other side of the aisle, I urge all members to support this bill, H.R. 2219, and I yield back to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Ms. Love.
Gentlelady, hit her microphone button, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to say that I'm grateful that we're addressing human trafficking today and marking up H.R. 2219. I share my support, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill. This is a horrible crime which has plagued humanity for centuries and is now more sophisticated than ever and is more profitable than ever, which means that this committee is a perfect place to address it. Human trafficking and all of its destructive form earns its criminals roughly $150 billion per year. 2/3 of this comes from commercial sexual exploitation. 71% of global trafficking victims are women and girls. This is a major industry with nothing but destructive impacts. I've seen these impacts firsthand. Earlier this year, I met with children forced into sex trafficking, some young enough to be in elementary school, and now have children of their own because they were treated as disposable commodities. Unfortunately, they are not alone. There are innocent children like them around the world who suffer. This must end. We need sophisticated and coordinated response that chokes off these evil activities wherever they are. The End Banking for Human Traffickers Act of 2017, H.R. 2219, is an important part of that necessary response. H.R. 2219 amends Victims of Sex Trafficking Violence Protection Act of 2000 and adds the Secretary of Treasury as a member of the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking. There's quite a bit of work that needs to be done, and I just want to echo the fact that I'm so proud to be part of such a good bipartisan effort to end this horrific crime. Thank you, and I yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to compliment Mr. Royce as being a truly visionary legislator to come up with this. I've worked on fighting sex trafficking for, 15 years now. Actually put the first bills before Congress, and I never thought of this idea. I think it's a great idea to crack down on the money. I think it'll have massive changes and massive results and could save lives. And I'm very, very pleased to be a co-sponsor. I urge all of my colleagues to co-sponsor this important bill. Human trafficking is the 21st century form of slavery. It is one of the worst crimes, if not the worst crime in the world, and it is continuing to grow because it is so profitable. We don't like to think about it that it's in our country, but it is in our country and growing. The numbers are estimated to be 400,000 women and girls worldwide. We do not have the numbers for the United States. And it is estimated to be over $150 billion in profits for this industry. It is the third fastest growing criminal activity in the world, preceded only by guns and drugs. But in those two cases, you sell it once. In sex trafficking, they sell the human body over and over and over again until they die. So to go after the money is a creative way to really follow it. The fact that so much money is generated, we know that it's got to be in the U.S. financial system. And because it is a cross-border system, where most cross-border activities deal in the dollar, then this proves that these criminal enterprises have access to the United States financial systems. So I feel that it's a very important bill, and it would require the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, which is the council of all bank regulators, to review and enhance their examination procedures to improve the ability of banks to target and root out financing related to human trafficking. And also it would add the Treasury Secretary to the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking, and require them to submit to us, to Congress and the regulators, detailed recommendations of how to improve banks' anti-money laundering programs to specifically target this terrible crime. Clearly, our anti-money laundering rules that are in place now are not good enough. And so having this crackdown on global financing and profits is a wonderful step forward. I congratulate my friend and colleague for coming up with this idea. I'm proud to join him in sponsoring it and working for its passage and implementation. I literally believe the bill can save lives. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to join the group of people who are, bipartisan group of people who are saying thanks to Congressman Royce for introducing H.R. 2219. This bill is at an important crux in the fight to end human trafficking. We must be able to track and disrupt the flow of illicit money in order to effectively penetrate the criminal organizations that profit from modern-day slavery. And I don't think many people understand the extent to which it exists. 25 million people are being trafficked globally, 70% women, 25% being children under the age of 18. Human trafficking targets the most vulnerable among us and exploits their inability to seek help. H.R. 2219 takes a common sense approach to improving the detection of trafficking within our financial system. Greater coordination among federal law enforcement, state and local law enforcement, and foreign governments will increase arrest and prosecution of traffickers. This is one of the sad stories in human trafficking, that only 14,000 on less than 15,000 prosecutions occurred in 2016, and only 9,000 convictions resulted that were targeting this global trafficking operation. As criminal organizations operate networks on a global scale, moving people from country to country, we must also adapt to movement of their money through the financial system. Reviewing financial institutions' procedures for detecting money laundering related to human trafficking will increase the reporting of suspicious activity and provide law enforcement with more information about the movement of traffickers. Although it is a global problem, the United States must continue to be a leader in combating human trafficking through enhanced coordination and implementing the newest detection methods for money laundering. I would again like to thank Congressman Royce for his leadership on this issue. It's imperative that we address the problem of human trafficking head-on. Without action, we leave the most vulnerable members of our communities open to continued exploitation, and we yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Let me first start by thanking the gentleman from California and chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Royce, for championing this important legislation. Human trafficking is an estimated multi-billion-dollar a year international enterprise that forces the most at risk among us into the horrors of modern-day slavery. It is also one of the fastest-growing crimes in the world. According to the United States State Department, human trafficking is among the world's top 3 criminal enterprises. That's why I've worked tirelessly prior to coming to Congress and since I've been here to fight human trafficking. Even in my home state of Ohio, reports show that human trafficking is on the rise. But what we know, Mr. Chairman, that no single system can successfully combat trafficking. Preventing, identifying, and serving victims of trafficking require a multi-coordinated approach across all levels of government. And as we have heard, this bill would assist in the coordination by putting the Secretary-Treasury on the President's interagency task force to monitor combat trafficking. I would also like to thank Mr. Royce and his staff for working with my office to include language in the bill that directs the interagency on trafficking to do more closely examining and making legislative recommendations to Congress about money laundering related to human trafficking, and more specifically, the use of emerging technologies and virtual currencies in laundering this money. In 2013, Acting Assistant Attorney General Raymond testified before the City Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs on some of the challenges the use of virtual currencies present law enforcement when used for illicit purposes such as human trafficking. In that testimony, he stated that, quote, Virtual currencies allow users to send money across the globe without dealing with a traditional financial institution. While this feature provides several benefits for legitimate customers, it can significantly complicate law enforcement efforts to follow the money. And lastly, he concluded his testimony by stating that law enforcement, Congress, and regulators must remain vigilant to ensure that the U.S. legal and regulatory structures is significantly robust to cover the decentralized virtual currencies, and I agree with him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I want to thank the gentleman from California for sponsoring this bill. I want to thank the chairman of Terrorism and Illicit Finance for holding hearings on this subject. And, but I want to talk about a couple things. As part of our committee, Terrorism and Illicit Finance, we have heard from witnesses from law enforcement about this subject and many others, and particularly the FBI. And it's an agency that we all respect and are concerned that there have been various attacks recently to undercut the FBI and the investigation that Robert Mueller is conducting into the presidency and collusion between the White House or the Trump administration and Russia. And I would just urge all of my colleagues to take that very seriously and to stand up for an agency like the FBI that is out there fighting against human trafficking and not allow it to be bullied in an effort to try to get it to back away from legitimate investigations. That's the first thing I want to talk about. The second is one that I brought up many times, Mr. Chairman, and I was considering offering it as an amendment to your bill, Mr. Royce, but I'm not going to do that. We have a bill, H.R. 2215, the Safe Banking Act of 2017, concerning marijuana and banking regulations and the inability of legitimate businesses to conduct their business through the financial system. And it's a bill that I brought up, and Mr. Heck and I, for 3 or 4 years now. We have 57 co-sponsors, a number of whom are on this particular committee. And despite having that kind of co-sponsorship, despite having brought it up year after year, we have yet to have a hearing, much less a markup. And today we've marked up some 60 bills in the last month or two, and I appreciate the chairman having regular order with respect to a lot of those bills. But I don't appreciate the fact that we have yet to even have a hearing. And I was thinking about trying to attach it to the bill. I made a statement about the legislation a week or so ago. 46 states now have some level of legalization of marijuana or cannabis, and it is time for this committee to address it so that banking services can be provided to the legitimate businesses. It is a public safety matter at this point, as well as just a business matter at this point. So I applaud Mr. Royce and his bill on human trafficking. I thank him for bringing it. Obviously, it has, I think, the full support of this committee as well as our subcommittee on terrorism and illicit finance. But I want to just continue to urge the chairman and this committee to take up 2215. I intend to offer it. I hope it will become the base text of some legislation coming out of our subcommittee. And if not, I intend to offer it as an amendment. So I thank the gentleman from California for his bill. I think that we need to support our law enforcement like the FBI and not undercut it. And I encourage this committee and especially the chairman to bring 2215 either for hearing or up for a markup at the earliest possible convenience. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
First thing I want to say, Mr. Chairman, is I want to express our great appreciation to the leadership that Congressman Royce has provided on this. I've served with him for 14 years here on the Financial Services Committee. He has dealt with this not only in terms of the human trafficking, but also drug trafficking, also terrorism financial trafficking. And in my 8 years with him on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we have led that fight. I also want to thank our ranking member, Ms. Waters, who has been working with him on this, and all of the sponsors and co-sponsors on this very, very important bipartisan piece of legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, excuse me, the one area I want to call attention to on this is when you look at what the International Labor Organization says, their latest statistics, 35.8 billion people who are trapped in this wretched and tragedy situation. And as Ms. Waters pointed out, 70% of them female. And most striking, 1/3 of them are children, all over this world. Now, the question has to be to me is, and also the International Labor Organization pointed out that it is now the fastest growing illegal activity all around the world. That depth, which says to me that there is a very supportive network that is carrying this forward. There are literally governments, Mr. Chairman, who are acquiescing to this. This is a very deep, penetrating issue. And I just raised this and try to describe it in this manner because here's my concern. Where are the resources? I assume there are there with the task that we are now laying to, additionally, to the Treasury Department. Where are they in the budget? Do we have the necessary manpower? Do we have the necessary intelligence forces? These are criminal organizations, many of whom are sanctioned by the governments in which they exist, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe, all over the world. And let me tell you, right here in the United States of America, drug trafficking and sex trafficking, and again, as I said, 70% women, 30% are children. So my whole point is, as we move this legislation forward, let us make sure that we are giving and setting up the proper infrastructure and giving the financial resources in the budget to the Secretary of Labor, Secretary of the Treasury, to make sure that they have the resources to do the job. And I know how we are concerned about the budget, but I think if we're serious about this, we've got to make sure that we're putting the money behind our passion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Royce, page 2, strike line 5 and all that follow.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Well, thank you. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, simply puts us on the same page with Senators Rubio and Warren on their good work in the other body. I've been working with them on this legislation, and additionally, yesterday we added language championed by our colleague Joyce Beatty from Ohio to ensure that we look at money launderers' use of new technologies and use of virtual currencies. I think that, as we discussed, the perpetrators of these degrading acts prey really on the defenseless in society. And yes, primarily women and girls. There's two types of trafficking we're focused on here. One is labor trafficking, and the other is underage trafficking of young girls and boys. And so we've got strong support for both sides of the aisle on this committee. I just, again, ask unanimous consent for this amendment or adoption of this amendment and unanimous consent on final passage.
Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Roy.
We had a...
I'm sorry? For what purpose does the gentleman from Nevada seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment acknowledges how essential it is to give victims a voice when making public policy decisions and the importance of working with the private sector in the fight against human trafficking. Specifically, the amendment would require the task force to complete an analysis of the anti-money laundering efforts taken by the U.S. government and U.S. financial institutions related to human trafficking. It also explicitly requires that the task force include in the recommendations feedback on industry best practices from financial institutions and feedback on policy proposals from stakeholders, including trafficking victims and financial institutions. This amendment would also further elevate the importance of combating illicit financing relating to human trafficking within the Treasury Department by codifying this function under the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence and by requiring an employee to be designated to specifically coordinate interagency efforts against human trafficking. I would also note that a number of the improvements that this amendment would make reflect the good work by Democrats on both sides of the Capitol. In addition to improvements that have been made to reflect language authored by Senator Warren, the amendment also incorporates a provision from the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, which would sharpen regulators' focus on the growing anti-money laundering risk posed by virtual currencies and other emergency technologies. And so I'm pleased not only with the substance of these improvements, but also with the bipartisan manner in which the sponsor of the legislation has approached this important issue. I plan to support the amendment, and I yield back the remaining balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Move to strike the last
Gentleman
word.
is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I want to thank the gentleman for bringing this amendment, really focusing on virtual currencies and the potential for cryptocurrencies to hide this illegal activity. Our anti-money laundering laws and our know your customer laws and all of those things are really focused on the fruits of an illegal activity. And this is one of those things, but what the gentleman has done from California is really, provide additional resources and additional sort of focus on this particularly, terrible activity. So our anti-money laundering and our know your customer efforts are designed to get at the fruits of so many illegal activities, but this one I'm glad the gentleman has highlighted and bringing this with Ms. Beatty's support and the support of the Senate to, into these new types of currencies that we're experiencing, and I think this will be helpful in stemming this. So I support this amendment, and I thank the gentleman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there any further discussion or amendment? If not, there being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purposes, gentlemen from California? Seek recognition?
Just seek a recorded vote on the
Recorded
final
vote has
pass.
been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 4546. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 4546 to amend the Securities Act of 1930.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we see time and again, static market regulation often does not keep pace with innovation. So in 1996, we in the House here amended the 33 Act, and we exempted 3 specific stock exchanges by name from state-by-state registration. Today, 2 of the 3 exchanges have merged. Enactment of the National Securities Exchange Parity Act would strike references to particular stock exchanges in the Security Act, and the bill would make it clear that the blue sky exemption from state-by-state registration is extended to all national securities exchanges registered with the SEC. So here's why it's important. If we just look back to why we did this in 96, you could ask anybody from Massachusetts, because if they tried to invest in a stock called Apple during its IPO, well, state regulators banned the stock for being too risky. Making it clear that this exemption applies to more than just 3 specific exchanges encourages new exchanges to become listing venues and a source of capital for companies looking to go public, to expand, to hire more workers, and so they do this through this process through the SEC. So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support what I think is a common sense technical fix. We've got bipartisan support for it. It's good for market competition. It's good for capital formation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Would you yield to the chairman?
I will, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to encourage all members to support H.R. 4546. I agree with the gentleman from California. This ought to be viewed as a technical fix and clarification. I mean, one of the exchanges that are referred to in current law doesn't even exist anymore. And unless we enact this, it leads to an unlevel playing field. It will harm innovation within our markets. And so I believe that, again, this is just a common sense technical fix that everyone should support. And I thank the gentleman from California for his leadership. I yield back to the gentleman from California.
If the gentleman will yield.
Will you yield to the gentleman from Michigan now?
I yield.
To save time, I would like to echo that of the chairman, as he points out. You know, even groups that had supported this previously are no longer the groups that they had been when they started their support of this. So BATS is now SIBO and other things. So this is absolutely a common sense thing to do. And I'll point out that you know, the new market system is still in place, reviewing these various markets, and this is absolutely the right thing to do. So with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from California. Thank you.
Gentleman from California, yield back. Gentleman from California yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes. Microphone, please.
H.R. 4546 is intended to address a 1996 law that explicitly preempted state oversight of 3 named stock exchanges and required any other exchange to prove to the SEC that its standards were just as robust to deserve state preemption. That law specifically listed the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, and NAHASDA, whose robust standards for listing securities were sufficient to preempt state regulation. Now, More than 20 years later, we have 21 securities exchanges, and the American Stock Exchange has been acquired by the New York Stock Exchange. So I realize that it may not make sense to judge exchange listing standards based on the 3 exchanges that we listed in the 1996 law, but H.R. 4546 does nothing to guide the SEC in how it should otherwise judge them for state preemption. Rather, the bill would completely remove the baseline standard, and with it, how the SEC currently interprets that standard to require certain core quantitative thresholds relating to, for example, revenue, market capitalization, number of shareholders, and share price. However, imperfect the current framework is for state preemption, I do not believe we should simply remove it and replace it with nothing. At best, doing so will create confusion. At worst, it will create a race to the bottom as exchanges try to compete for business by lowering their listing standards. I'm also disappointed to see that this bill rolls back the bipartisan compromise we ultimately reached last Congress before the bill went to the floor. That bill, as amended, would have at least required the SEC to develop minimum core quantitative listing standards. And for these reasons, I would urge my colleagues to join me in opposing the bill. And I have some opposition that has been indicated to this bill that I would like to enter into the record. And so I would ask unanimous consent to enter into record the opposition from the Americans for Financial Reform, Consumer Federation of America, Public Citizen, and the Northern American Securities Administrators Association.
Without objection.
And furthermore, according to the North American Securities Administrators Association, quote, fair and rigorous listing standards are essential. Such listing standards give investors a voice when it comes to important decisions, ensure independent directors are in place to watch out for investors, provide oversight of conflicts of interest to ensure investors have a chance at earning a return. By removing the statutory references to the listing standards of named National Securities Exchange in 18B of the Securities Act, H.R. 4546 threatens to undercut the distinction between different types of exchanges with potentially different types of listing standards to the detriment of investors. For these reasons, the NASAA, that is, the North American Securities Administrators Association, opposes the bill and urges the committee to reject it in its present form. That's the end of the quote. I would urge my colleagues to join me in opposing H.R. 4546, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Mr. Royce.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Here's the difficulty. I mean, the argument doesn't really stand because I'd just like to point out that this exemption is only for exchanges firmly under the jurisdiction of the SEC. This is built based on what was done in '96. As a matter of fact, the bipartisan Republican and Democratic regulatory reform package that's come out of the Senate, our Senate counterparts committee, is identical to this language, and it's for that reason. The fix does not jeopardize the safety and soundness of our capital markets or investor protections. What the fix is identical to the existing set of circumstances, except that we recognize that we have a situation where the SEC has got to make a formal finding that with any proposed changes to the listing standards, those standards remain substantially similar to those of the NYSE or NASDAQ. We've got to reference the change here to include those entities that have merged or changed their designation. So we're codifying this for the benefit of both investors, and we're codifying it for the benefit of the SEC so that they can move in tandem with statutory law. That's why it's in the Senate provision. That's why it needs to be law on the House side, that we need to pass this into the Senate, and with that, I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield to Mr. Holgren.
Thank you. I also want to thank Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce, for introducing, again, the National Securities Exchange Regulatory Parity Act. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this, and I've been proud to work with him in the past on previous legislations, and also would echo that I'm encouraged. It looks like the Senate is moving on this as well. As he has said, and others have said, this is a common sense technical fix to a 20-year-old statute that didn't foresee, or at least didn't contemplate, an increase in the number of exchanges and today's competitive market structure. The unintended consequences of Congress's amendment to include specific references to just a few exchanges is a two-tiered and unfair treatment to new exchanges that have since registered with the SEC. For example, the Chicago Stock Exchange, under current law, cannot make changes to its listing standards before NYSE or the national market system of the NASDAQ stock market makes changes to its listing standards. Only then can the SEC deem these standards to be substantially similar. The Chicago Stock Exchange could then request SEC determination by rule their listing standard is consistent with the Exchange Act of 1934. I'd like to read just a brief excerpt from the Chicago Stock Exchange explaining the importance of the bill. Currently, the Chicago Stock Exchange, and I quote, is not a primary listing exchange for any securities, in part because such securities would be subject to both federal and state regulation, which is prohibitively costly and overly burdensome to potential listing companies. This change would remove this current impediment to companies listing their securities on the CHX and would help in the exchange's efforts to develop a robust primary listing market here in Illinois. I'm proud to support, end quote, I'm proud to support such a common sense technical fix that will increase access to capital markets in Illinois. But this is not just an issue for the Chicago Stock Exchange, also impacts, as was mentioned, BATS, supported by CBOE and others, so grateful for that. This bill is about improving access to capital by creating a level playing field, and nothing in the bill should be construed as weakening investor protections or reducing the authority of the SEC. Securities listed on the National Securities Exchange will continue to be subject to substantial and significant oversight by the SEC and the exchange in which they're listed. It's important to emphasize that the SEC would still have to approve any changes in listing standards, just as they do now. Furthermore, securities listed and traded on national securities exchanges are generally subjected to Sarbanes-Oxley requirements such as audited financial corporate responsibility requirements and enhanced financial disclosures. Additionally, the 34 Act requires, among other things, that the rules on a national security exchange be designed to promote just and equitable principles of trade, to remove impediments to and perfect the mechanism of a free and open market and a national market system, and in general to protect investors and the public interest. Securities registered with the SEC and listed on exchange are also subject to robust disclosures, as I mentioned. So again, I support this. I ask all of my colleagues and encourage them to support it, and thank Chairman Royce, and I yield back.
I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, actually, I defer to the gentleman from Massachusetts if he would like to go.
That's okay.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, for what purpose does he seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. While I must say I am totally supportive of the gentleman from California's previous bill on trafficking, I cannot commit to support on this bill. This bill would actually eliminate state supervision of securities if they're listed on an exchange, even if the exchange has reduced listing standards, as my reading of the bill informs me. So the gentleman is correct that we created exemptions for the big exchanges back in, I believe, '96. However, this change would, I believe, create a race to the bottom where, unlike the named markets, the listing standards would be greatly reduced. The SEC requirements are tied to the effort to prevent fraud, to serve the public interest, and protect investors. And in many states, such as my own, in Massachusetts, we have a very active Secretary of State and Attorney General that provide a layer of protection to investors within our state that would be eliminated by this change. Now, I'm sure there are states that don't have the rigorous protections that Massachusetts does and some other states do, but the state of the law right now allows us to have a cop on the street and to protect investors. And I think that what we're doing here is eliminating a great layer of protection for investors that would open up opportunities, I think, for reduced standards. There may even be states where a relaxed standard is an attraction to some issuers who would forum shop, I guess, would be a good analogy, to go to that state that would have that exchange that would have the weakest standard. That's my concern here. You know, we're in a day where the markets are off the charts. The economy has never been better. The stock market, as I say, is hitting all-time records. Issuers are not having problems. And so I'm puzzled why we're making a huge change here when things are operating pretty well, I think, according to most standards. And I'm very, very concerned that this reduces the integrity that the SEC provides by having very robust, very strong listing standards that would be, I think, eroded if this 4546 were to become law. So I just urge my colleagues to be very, very careful about this. It may be well-intended. I'm not denigrating the intent here, but I believe that the effect of this bill would be to greatly reduce protections to investors. It would increase the likelihood of fraud, and it would not serve the public interest. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I erroneously thought that this was going to be easier than...
Gentleman, move to strike the last word.
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is
Sorry about
recognized for
that.
5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. As I said, I had hoped that this was going to be easier, but it's Tuesday, therefore the minority must oppose it. This does not make sense. Here's why. First scenario, as has been sort of laid out, a state exchange that is operating within a state wants to remain only within that state, it will then fall under state regulators. I will point out that, for example, the fine regulators in Massachusetts denied the citizens of Massachusetts the ability to buy Apple on its initial IPO, but those are the decisions that state regulators make. Second scenario is you have an exchange that wants to become a national exchange. It then has to, A, apply to the Securities and Exchange Commission. B, it then has to be approved by the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is all under the national, national purview of how they're going to be regulated. The national market system requires the Securities and Exchange Commission to then approve all of their operations. And so at that point, they have shifted from those state regulators to national regulators, and the SEC is going to continue to regulate them. So one way or the other, they are being regulated. They're going to continue to be regulated by their state regulators, or they are going to be shifting as they become a national exchange to then be regulated by the SEC. It's not like it is suddenly, oh, you're let out of this regulatory pen somehow, and you can kind of go do whatever you want to go do. There is simply no scenario where they're just going to be able to run amok and do whatever they want to do. The gentleman's intent, I know, is to make sure that we maintain integrity and protection for investors. I believe that this bill does that. It just shifts who is doing it. And that's why this bill makes sense, because there's fast-moving and dynamic consolidations that have happened and purchases that have happened and growth that has happened. We've gone from 3 in 1996 to 21 now here in the U.S. that are national exchanges.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield.
Question to my friend from Michigan or to the chairman. So you make a good argument. My question is, what kinds of resources do we provide to the SEC to take on additional exchanges and the supervision of additional exchanges if the exchange chooses to leave the state and move to the national field of play? I'd yield back.
Sure, yeah, reclaiming the time. That should have been a question, I guess, for the previous 18 additional exchanges that have happened over the years. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been managed to add 18 of them over the years. So I don't see that as it being an ongoing issue. It's not like suddenly they don't have this, or they have this deficit of resources or availability on that. I will note as well, and the gentleman from California had alluded to this. In the Senate, when this bill was being debated as part of the package, there was 111 amendments, is my understanding. 111 total amendments that were offered to the package of bills that Chairman Crapo had been operating under. Not one addressed any of the concerns dealing with this particular issue. So the Senate has taken a look at it, and I'm not one to buy lock, stock, and barrel anything and everything that the Senate does. But I do like it when the Senate actually makes sense. So I think this is that scenario where it does make sense. Otherwise, the gentleman, this committee's going to have to go back in, and every time that there's an exchange that either merges or buys or sells, we've got BATS becoming SIBO, then we've got to go back in and change the legislation somehow, it would seem to me. But gentleman from California, I yield.
Yeah. And the other point that I would just like to make is obviously the SEC can block a listing standard right now or a change to a listing standard right now. And again, just to make the point, the exemption is only for exchanges firmly under the jurisdiction of the SEC. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Yeah.
Who seeks recognition? What purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield to my friend from Massachusetts.
Thank you. May I ask the gentleman from California, your amendment, well, your bill, which amends the current law, strikes the language that requires, and this is the quoted language that you're striking, that has listing standards that the Commission determines by rule are substantially similar to the listing standards applicable to securities described in subparagraph A. So you're striking the requirement that they have, that the Commission determines by rule on its own initiative or on the basis of petition that those standards are substantially similar to the listing standards applicable to the securities in subparagraph A. So you're lowering the standard here.
There's no lower, if I may respond, there's no lowering of the standards. Let me give you an example. The SEC extended the blue sky exemption to BAT, yet because BATS, and they subsequently
petitioned,
with a CBOE,
I believe, right?
Okay, because it isn't specifically listed in the Securities Act, the SEC must make a formal finding that with any proposed changes to BATS listing standards, those standards remain substantially similar, and this is the point.
And that's a determination by the SEC, though.
But think on this,
substantially similar.
Time belongs to the gentleman. Time belongs to the gentleman of Massachusetts.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at here.
I know.
Here's the problem. The SEC does have the ability, if an exchange has rules and listing standards, that exchange does have the ability to go to the SEC and say, we believe these are substantially similar. They can petition the SEC, and the SEC can say, you know what, they are, and we'll deem them accepted.
Will the gentleman
However,
yield so I can
just
explain?
after I finish my thought, sure. And believe me, this is a conversation, I hope.
Yes.
So that's what I don't want to eliminate. I want the SEC to maintain that hard standard and keep the process going where these new exchanges, if they do have equally robust and equally protective and fraud preventing standards, that they could be approved. And your amendment, your law, your change here would do away with that.
Actually,
now,
the chair corrects himself. The time belongs to the gentleman from Colorado.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado for yielding here. The point here is that the SEC sets the standard, right?
Right.
So under a 96 law, the point that I'm making here is that this becomes identical to the standard that is set not by the SEC, but the standard that was specifically set for the NYSE. Now, the argument is, why would you not just allow the SEC to set the standard, not the identical standard? Because otherwise you're going to stifle innovation, you're going to stifle competition, you're going to stifle the availability of capital. You want the SEC to set the standard. You don't want to necessarily mandate it be the identical standard. That is why on the Senate side that change is made, and that's why this change is made on the House.
The gentleman.
I'd reclaim my time and yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, at least we've clarified this. I do want the single standard. I want the SEC standard. I think that served us well. I don't want every Tom, Dick, and Harry, different exchange coming in with their own standard that may vary a little bit less, because that does induce a race to the bottom. And so, again, it doesn't change my position. It just
I thank
back to California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The listing standards are actually set by the exchanges. The exchanges then go to the SEC. The SEC makes the decision at that point, or this is the way it should work, whether or not those standards are the proper standards. That's the point.
Reclaiming my time, I yield back to the
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion or amendment? If not, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
To request it.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 4519. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 4519 to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to repeal certain disclosure requirements related to resource extraction and for other
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're here to discuss my bill, H.R. 4519, that would repeal a well-intentioned, but I'd argue a very misguided provision in the Dodd-Frank Act. Specifically, Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act requires public companies engaged in the commercial development of natural gas, minerals, or oil to disclose non-material information to the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding payments made to foreign or to the U.S. federal government relating to the commercial development of oil, natural gas, and minerals. So this isn't just a foreign issue, this is also an issue that deals with us here domestically. Specifically, companies subject to Section 1504 must report the type and total amount of payments made for each project, as well as the type and total amounts of payments made to each government. These payments cover taxes, royalties, fees, production entitlements, and bonuses. Some have used the financial crisis to hijack federal securities law in order to push a socially motivated agenda, and Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act was, like many of the provisions that were ultimately included in the sprawling law, they had absolutely no relation to the underlying cause of the financial and housing crisis. The Dodd-Frank was merely a vehicle. Proponents of Section 1504 claim that the disclosure of payments from resource extraction companies to governments may prevent the leaders of poor countries from embezzling money earned from oil and mineral sales. While this may be a laudable goal and is a laudable goal, using federal securities laws and the SEC to enforce social issues is inconsistent with the SEC's core mission and completely inappropriate. Just to remind everyone, the SEC's mission by law, by us, by declaration, is number 1, to protect investors, number 2, to maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and to 3, facilitate capital formation. The SEC recognized this fact and stated that Section 1504, quote, appears designed primarily to advance U.S. foreign policy objectives, close quote, not investor protection or capital formation. Notwithstanding the merits of underlying policy goals, conducting American foreign policy is not what Congress created the SEC to do. With all due respect to the commissioners and the SEC staff, none of them are foreign policy experts. On January 30 of 2017, I introduced H.J. Res. 41, a resolution of disapproval pursuant to the Congressional Review Act that would nullify the SEC's resource extraction final rule. My resolution passed the House on February 1 by a vote of 235 to 187 and was signed into law by President Trump on February 14. I believe that it is important to note that while the joint resolution vacated the rule, it did not eliminate the authority for the SEC to promulgate an appropriate rule under Section 1504. In fact, Section 1504 specifically mandates that the SEC shall prescribe these rules, which means the SEC still is required to issue these rules. Under the CRA, if Congress successfully enacts a joint resolution to vacate an agency rule, in most circumstances the agency may not promulgate the same rule again. By definition, a rule subject to an enacted joint resolution of disapproval, quote, may not be reissued in substantially the same form, and a new rule that is substantially the same may not be issued unless the reissued or new rule is specifically authorized by a law enacted after the date of the joint resolution, close quote. However, the CRA does not define the scope of, quote, substantially the same, end quote. That criteria should be considered, or who should make such a determination. For this reason, H.R. 4519 is necessary in order to eliminate the authority of the SEC to issue another resource extraction rule at some point in the future. As we debate the bill, let's be clear on what this isn't about. Some have tried to argue that a vote to repeal this provision is a vote for corruption. This couldn't be further from the truth. Despite claims to the contrary, the bill does nothing to undermine the ability of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice to police against foreign corruption. Both of these agencies still have at their disposal multiple federal laws, including the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, which prohibits bribing foreign officials to assist in obtaining or retaining business by public companies or their agents. To be clear, fraud will still be fraud, and corruption will still be corruption. Both are still illegal activities that can and should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. The administration is restoring regulatory balance by reining in Washington bureaucrats, and the SEC is rightfully refocusing its efforts on helping investors make informed investment decisions as Congress intended it to, instead of imposing non-material disclosure requirements that only seem to push social agenda. In October, the Treasury Department issued its capital markets report recommending that Congress repeal Section 1504 and any rules pursuant to this section. The report went on to further recommend that if Congress determined this provision should be maintained, then regulatory oversight should be moved to a, quote, more appropriate federal agency, such as the Departments of State, Commerce, Homeland Security, Labor, or Energy. It's important to note that, to point out that governments and industries have been engaged in the global effort to strengthen transparency and accountability pertaining to payments to foreign governments for oil, gas, and mineral resources, known as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI. The U.S. is one of 51 countries currently implementing this framework. EITI provides the disclosure by companies and governments of payments that are independently assessed and publicly issued in a report. The U.S. EITI and further adoption of EITI globally can provide for a broader set of data, since the SEC's resource extraction rule applies only to U.S.-listed companies and does not require private nor foreign state-owned entities to file these mandatory disclosures as well. So, and I know I'm over, Mr. Chairman, or Madam Chair, appreciate your indulgence. The SEC is not the enforcer of social issues and should not be focused on those. It has a job to do. The Department of Justice and the State Department have their job to do as well, and this bill will allow them to do that, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, seek
I
recognition?
move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman, I was struck by how quickly the Republican leadership made it a priority earlier this year to undermine American efforts to combat global corruption by striking the implementing rule for Section 1504 of Dodd-Frank. This rule requires companies to disclose payments they make to governments for oil, gas, and mining resources, which protects American companies' democratic interests and the rule of law around the globe, opening the extractive industry sector to greater public scrutiny is fundamental to improving governance, curbing corruption, improving revenue management, and allowing citizens to demand greater accountability from their government for spending that serves the public interest. Moreover, undisclosed payments are corrosive to free enterprise. They destroy trust and transparency. Investors and the public need to be able to fully evaluate whether a company has properly addressed the commercial, political, and legal risk it faces when operating around the globe in environments where corruption is rife and rule of law weak. Now, as my Republican colleagues argue in support of this legislation, I hope they will show a little more deference to reality than they did earlier this year when Republicans came together to strike the SEC rule on the law. Two arguments in particular held sway, neither with any basis in fact. The first was that the law put U.S. companies at a competitive disadvantage to their foreign competitors. First, foreign companies on U.S. exchanges are also required to report under the U.S. rules, including a number of state-owned oil companies such as China's China and Sinopec, and Brazil's Petrobras. Second, after SEC issued its rule in 2012, the rest of the world followed our lead, establishing a global standard for the public disclosure of extractive payments companies make to governments. Now, over 30 countries, including all EU member states, the UK, Norway, and Canada, have adopted similar disclosure rules which cover the vast majority of oil, gas, and mining companies that compete with American firms. Leading global oil companies are already reporting, including BP, Shell, and Total, and Russia's state-owned companies Gazprom, Rosneft, and Lukoil, are entering their third year of reporting under EU rules without any negative impact. So contrary to Republican claims, U.S. and foreign companies are competing on a level playing field now more than ever. A number of members also claim that gutting the rule was about jobs. The chairman claimed, for example, that voting for the resolution was a vote for jobs, calling on his colleagues to vote down this so-called leftist elitist agenda, declaring war on carbon-based jobs. And quote unquote, in signing the resolution, this president said, "We're bringing back jobs big league. We're bringing them back at the plant level. We're bringing them back at the mine level. The energy jobs are coming back," quote unquote. No, they aren't. In fact, there are no jobs to bring back because not a single job had been lost to this rule for which compliance hadn't even begun yet. As a matter of fact, oil and gas giants like Shell, Total, BP, State Oil, and some of the biggest mining companies like Rio Tinto and Newmont are among those already reporting. None has reported the loss of any jobs nor any financial losses as a result of disclosure. The law is simply a simple reporting requirement and has no impact on any aspect of a company's business operations. There's no public benefit to striking this law unless one wants to fuel corruption, create opaque business environments, and show the world that the U.S. doesn't support its global commitments or the public good. So for all of these reasons, I urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members that seek recognition as we're getting ready and close to adjournment here?
Yeah, Mr. Lynch, let's go ahead and ask for the floor, and we'll continue to.
I think we're going to have to recess, so I'd ask members to hang on to those comments. Committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair, and the chair anticipates that we will reconvene at approximately 145. This will be immediately following floor consideration of H.R. 3971. We stand in recess.